Leyland Walker is an asset management business specialising in healthcare real estate. Over the last 6 or 7 years, we have had mandates from institutional investors such as Aviva and a collection of others. Subsequent to that, our main investor was private equity in Lone Star, which is a slightly different emphasis. More recently, we've had the best of all. Our recent new investor is major investor is Difficut, which is a pan-European REIT, and I'll leave Stefan to talk about that. I think from our perspective, having seen the market come and go, and I'm of an age where I've seen a couple of ups and downs within the market, I can't remember a time where there's been so much capital chasing healthcare real estate, and I'm talking about care homes, etc., as well as retirement living, which is a relatively nascent market in the UK. But I think we're in a very interesting period from that point of view. In terms of, we get very involved in understanding our tenants' operations, very in-depth asset management in terms of, because we think that's necessary within healthcare. We think it's very interesting times, and I think this emerging asset class is one of the interesting growth potential sectors in the UK.
Great. Stefan.
Thank you. In a nutshell, so I'm Stefan, CEO of Difficut. I've been with the company since it was founded in 2005, and we're a listed REIT since 2006. Now, what is specific, I think, of Difficut is that we are one of the very few pure-play healthcare real estate investors in Europe as a REIT. If you look at our portfolio today, we've invested roughly 2.3 billion euros in 4 countries today, which are Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK. So I'm very glad to have heard the presentation before. Now, this being said, we tend to say that we're more or less a senior housing specialist, but I'm going to change that right now, because if you look at our portfolio, 75% is about care dependency, so that would be care homes in the UK. I think only roughly 7 or 8% is senior housing, the way it was defined right now here. And that's maybe something that we will see in Europe more and more popping up. I think the remainder of our portfolio are actually mixed facilities, where we have combinations of care dependency and senior housing. Only 1% of our portfolio has nothing to do with elderly people, and that's more or less residential care for people with disabilities, so you would call that specialist care.
Okay, good. Samantha.
Samantha Broland. I'm a director in the operational capital markets team at Savills. I've specialised in healthcare for the last 15 years. My remit actually covers all healthcare, so primary care, long-term care, and senior living.
Well, my name is Robin Boyce. I'm a partner at Difficut. I'm one of the 4 partners of this beautiful company. We are a leading consultancy and development company in the Netherlands, and we are totally focused on alternative assets. In the range from healthcare to educational facilities, student housing, etc. And next to my position of AGO, I'm also a lecturer at the Amsterdam School of Real Estate since 2012 on the topics of healthcare, finance.
And my name's Candace Blackwood. I lead the real estate healthcare team at CMS, who are a large firm of global lawyers. We have over 700 lawyers on the real estate side, and we've covered all aspects of public and private healthcare, from hospitals, care homes, retirement communities, social housing, also known as supported living.
Great, thank you. Stefan, let's just start with you. I mean, interesting that we got there from Lydia, her version of what healthcare is versus senior living. You're active across Europe, so are there differences in how that's viewed, the split between what would be senior living, healthcare, and the crossover with that? How do you see that within the portfolio that you're working in?
We're much more specialists in care homes and care dependency. I think for lots of reasons, because that was the first segment of the market that became really interesting for investors. Has something to do with aging, with consolidation of operators, with the fact there's lots of public money available, which is financing care in these care homes. And these are things that we, until recently, didn't see as such in the what you would call the senior housing market. Senior housing is much more about the free choice of people, which is a huge difference with the care home. Nobody goes by his own choice into a care home. There are surveys done throughout Europe showing that baby boomers, they only have one wish, that is to stay in their own house until the very last minute of their life. The only exception, and it's once again, it's not a choice, it's when you become totally care dependent. Your children or your environment or your physician will order you to go to a care home, but everything in between really is a free choice. So that means that it is a market where you really have to make a much bigger effort in terms of coming with a marketing proposition to these people, convincing them to leave their own home, move into your facilities, come up with some care concepts behind it. And that was lacking until recently. We didn't see lots of very specialized senior housing operators, but we're starting to find them right now. And you mentioned one of the examples in France, which is Domitis. We know them quite well. And they're working, well, I think for roughly 10 years right now and developing a company. We see things like that also happening right now in Germany. Very often, in the German case, it's coming from not-for-profit operators. We see similar things happening in the Netherlands, and then very often we're talking about not-for-profit operators. And we have one example where it can really go wrong, that's Belgium. Very, very mature healthcare market, very mature care home / senior housing market. But the senior housing segment became totally dominated by real estate developers, and they actually, what they did, they built sort of apartment buildings, sold them off to private investors without really a good care concept or service concept behind it. And you see that the occupancy rates of these buildings are very, very low. So it really is not just building apartments, it's really coming up also with a good concept behind it.
Ron, just give me an update, if you can, on the Netherlands, what you're particularly seeing there, because it was interesting that it was pointed out in Lydia's research as somewhere where you've got higher pensions generally and economic growth. What's your sense there of, and I know you're a specialist more in healthcare, but if you've got any views on the senior living side as well, let me know.
Yeah. Well, I was also quite happy with the research, because it's good to have a discussion also about definitions. I think in the Netherlands you see two developments. On one side you see the senior housing demand. It's indeed increasing enormously. But on the other hand we see more and more specialized facilities like nursing homes. And I think it's indeed quite important that operators in the Netherlands, most of them have quite outdated properties, outdated portfolios. So there's a lot of capital needed to upgrade their existing portfolios, also with the Paris Agreement in the mind. So indeed, in the Netherlands, last year we had about 1 billion of deal flow only in healthcare. So when I'm talking about healthcare, it's from senior housing to nursing homes. And don't forget also the cure side, because medical office buildings, specialized hospitals, it's also interesting, but it's again a different type of asset also for the investor. And I'm quite curious about the senior housing side when you look at the operation, because to my humble opinion, investors also should be most of some sort of active manager on these properties, because you can't desire a master lease for a senior housing project. So I think that's quite an advantage to solve this puzzle with each other, to build for rent senior housing, but also to mix it with the investor side. I'm also quite curious what's the opinion about Stefan from an investor perspective, whether you are also willing to go one-on-one instead of a master lease.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Strictly business to business.
Yeah. But I think that's quite a big challenge for us all to develop this specific asset class.
Okay, good. And Samantha, just in terms of the UK and also your sort of view and how that fits within the European perspective, how do you see that from the point of view of both senior living and healthcare?
I think from a senior living perspective, we're still fairly embryonic, to be honest. What to date, everyone's been sort of more focused on the actual real estate, whereas actually sitting behind it, you've got the operational element to it. But equally, picking up on Ron's comment as well, is looking at the other healthcare facilities. So looking at the primary healthcare, looking at the hospitals, because quite often, especially when you go through planning, the first thing that comes back from the planner says, well, can the existing services cope? And what they don't realise is that actually a lot of people are migrating. They're not migrating into the area. They're actually already there, but they just don't have sufficient facilities.
Okay, good. It might be interesting, Candace, just to pick up on, in terms of planning, taxation, those kinds of things. What are, I suppose, are the differences, and are there advantages in terms of ESG and those kinds of things, in terms of healthcare, senior living? How does that fit?
Well, I think ESG is healthcare and retirement living. I mean, it ticks all the boxes, and healthcare and retirement living are fairly well regulated, certainly in the UK through Care Quality Commission, and well understood, I think, or increasingly well understood by investors. I think picking up on the planning points, I agree with you, Samantha. It is a constant issue when submitting applications for new care homes, new retirement living development, is what about the wider facilities? And that's why with the Association of Retirement Operators, we've been working hard on the whole idea of retirement communities, because retirement living works very well alongside a primary school with wider community engagement, decent transport links. And I think it's a good prospect to sell. It's been disappointing in the UK that the London Plan and the discussions around planning have actually not created retirement living. At the moment, they're a retirement living use class. At the moment, it's institutional residences under C2 or living under C3, residential living. And there's we've acted for one client that had a real battle with the planners and ended up with what's known in the UK as sui generis, i.e. stand-alone for a retirement living community. So I think we'd like to see, and we're lobbying hard through the BPF and other organisations, to actually get the planners to think slightly differently about retirement living.
And Bruce, obviously you're operating here in the UK and asset managing for Stefan. How do you deal with some of those particular challenges that you're seeing here in the UK market?
I think retirement living specifically is again not as developed as we said as in other parts of Europe. So I think there's a couple of reasons for that. It's been largely a development model here. So the most successful probably is McCarthy and Stone building a sort of mid-market product. And I think there's a number of reasons why over a long period of time it was partly a cultural thing. People didn't want to go into sort of retirement village. British had a bit of an issue with that. I think it's also land costs. So in a strong market, developers will always outbid for just general housing, because as Candace says, there's not this specific asset class, and therefore planning-wise there wasn't, perhaps it wasn't carved out. And so what you see is, and what we see sometimes is a care home is built with a few retirement flats or bungalows or whatever on the same plot. So that's quite a small scale. It's quite easy to service from the care facility. I think from a rental model, from what I've seen since we got to know Stefan and his team in Belgium, they're quite often building a care home with some retirement apartments as part of the same block, and therefore you get the one lease overall. And I think that would be attractive to us. I think the issue again in Britain, I think it's starting to evolve where there's more demand. But you are, in the development model, you're always linked to the housing market. McCarthy and Stone fell over first time around because of the slow housing market. There were plenty of people who wanted to buy their units. They just couldn't sell their house. And when we had, some years ago, an involvement, not after the financial downturn, and actually some of the families says, we don't want to buy a flat, we'd actually rather rent it, because they just sold or couldn't sell granny's flat or house. The liquidity in the family are going, we ain't putting the money in there, we've only just got the liquidity. And so actually I think there is quite an appetite potentially for a number of reasons for a rental model, but from an investor's point of view, it's got to be investable. There's a lot of complication with dealing with individuals.
Okay, good. I'm going to pick up some of the specific points around covenants and those kinds of things that have been coming in, so thanks very much for that. Do come in with those, and anything you specifically want answered, just put a like on it and it'll move up on the top of my phone. But Stefan, I just want to talk a little bit briefly about some of the broader kind of areas. How important for you are things, are the demographics when you're looking at an investment or you're looking to move into a new geography like you moved into the UK? What's driving those investment decisions?
Basically, and I'm summarizing, but basically we're looking into three drivers. The first one being, of course, demographics, but that's a no-brainer because demographics for the UK are exactly the same as the ones for Belgium and the Netherlands. Germany is a little bit the odd one out because they're aging quite rapidly and are actually to the point of extinction because the total population of Germany is diminishing. But this being said, so that really does not distinguish countries from one another in Europe. What are more important drivers is what I would call the maturity of the markets in terms of consolidation of the healthcare operators. What you have seen in countries like France and Belgium, what you're seeing today in Germany, what is just starting now in the Netherlands, is that the operator market is shifting from a very fragmented market, meaning very small local operators, be it profit or not for profit, shifting towards bigger groups. And when I say bigger groups, we already have on the continent have now European groups, mostly with a French origin, like Corian, like Orpea. They started out as small operators 20 years ago. Now they're big, major European companies, listed companies. And this is something you have seen happening, like in the countries I mentioned. You see it happening in Germany. And then you have a phenomenon of double growth, meaning the market in itself is growing due to aging, and the companies, the operators, are growing entities. So they need to finance growth, and when they have this pressure to finance this growth, they want to become very often asset light, meaning they're kicking out real estate out of their balance sheet and looking for specialized investors to team up with them. So basically, this allowed us to grow over the last 10 years. And then the third one, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that, I think it's quite obvious, are the authorities. There's certainly on the continent going lots of public money into the care industries, but, and in most cases financing care dependencies. One of the reasons why care dependency is so important to us, we have very stable cash flows coming from the governments to this industry. So you want to understand how these local governments are thinking about care. What is their strategy? How will they be financing it in the long run? And then you see differences throughout Europe. Basically, to be quite honest, the UK is quite different from the continent. When I look at the income of a UK operator, it's not so different from the income of a European operator. So there are differences in legislation. But you see the north of Europe, which has a very embedded social security system, which is very stable. So that means low risk. If you look at southern Europe, they don't have these well-developed social security systems. So they're interesting markets today, but they're presenting a lot higher risk. So you have to play around with all of these drivers.
Okay, good. I've got a couple of quick questions that I'll come in on. One, which is, Candace, you mentioned schemes that didn't work in London. Is there a difference between London and the regions? In that, is there a sort of successful communities is there an example of that elsewhere in the UK, or is it just not really working in the UK at the moment?
I don't think I said schemes that didn't work in London. I think we were disappointed that the use classes, there wasn't a mention of that use class in the London plan.
I may have short-circuited. I also just tweeted that Stefan had predicted the end of Germany. Sorry, Candace, go.
No, not at all. I mean, I think there are schemes in London at the moment that are being actively developed and built, and the predictions are very good. I think there's also some interesting discussion amongst some of the developers who are building very large central London housing estates, and with the slight downturn in the London housing market, are actually looking at changing some of those developments partially into retirement living and supported living. So I think the margin's very good. I think also investors, certainly Brookfield, we were with last week, and they have invested in this space in Manchester, Sheffield, Birmingham, the north of England, because London was too expensive. So yes, I think there are opportunities everywhere in the UK because of the demographics.
And one question that's just come in that I wanted to pick up is around that idea of senior living tourism, which actually you mentioned a little bit there, I think, Lydia. And interestingly, whereas we've always thought about it as people moving towards warmer climes, but actually you mentioned there, interestingly, that people also trying to escape from areas that are maybe too hot. What's the sense of anybody here on that sort of health tourism, senior living tourism? Do you see that as a major part across Europe going forward?
I think a minor part.
Part?
Actually, we had a discussion during the MIPIM, also with our Italian colleagues. Well, I think that's one of the interesting holiday points, but I think it's a minor issue.
Yeah. Actually, what we see is that people tend to go back to where they come from when they become care dependent, because you lose your mobility. And it's very nice to be somewhere at the seaside in Spain when everybody's coming over and you're mobile. You can go everywhere you want yourself, but once you're in there, sitting in your apartment, not able to do anything, very often people go back. This being said, I recently learned from some Spanish operators that there is now really a sort of care home industry and probably also senior housing industry, which is really focusing on UK people, Germans, France, not so much French people, but UK and Germany, who moved over there, grew old over there, became care dependent and don't go back. So that's quite a recent phenomenon. So it could become a market.
Okay, good. I've got another one here which is around covenants, and are the covenants challenging leverage staff, small scale regulations, the scale of operations? How challenging is that? Does anybody want to take that up?
Well, as I said, we get very detailed in terms of how we work with our opcos. So we analyse monthly management accounts, which we get a great deal of detail about staff costs, agency, etc. In our view, that's the only way that you can actually stay on top of the assets you've got, because it may be a bit of an exaggeration to say, but there are very, very few robust covenants in the UK. This is sort of elderly care market, and therefore you've always got to be thinking, well, what would I do with this asset if it's not the people who are running it now in the investment proposition today? Who else could I get to run it? We have 14 key tenant relationships, most of whom we're very happy to I think work on more further investment with, but I think because it's an operational asset class, and I think this is filtering through to other areas like retail, etc., where people are finally finding out, oh, I needed to understand actually if that shop was successful, not just sit and collect the rent. You know, so my team spend a lot of time in the homes, you know, the home manager, understanding what the local competition is. So for each of our 100 assets, we've hopefully got a plan B and maybe a plan C. So covenant is important, but it's a rare thing in this sector. And you see some of the very tight yields for the perceived undoubted covenants of the third sector, which I think is, in my personal opinion, maybe overvalued, but I think people are chasing that sort of security. So it's a rare thing, is my point.
Okay. Candace, did you want to pick that up?
No, I would agree with Bruce on that. I think we're also seeing it in the supported living or social housing sectors where investors have invested, and there are a limited number of registered providers providing supported living, which is support for people with severe Asperger's, autism, those sorts of cases, and often a long-term living arrangement. And the investors in those markets are actually having their share price affected by the registered providers' perceived concerns from the regulator. So I agree entirely with Bruce.
I wanted to pick up, maybe with you, Samantha, just in terms of if we're looking at, I mean, Lydia mentioned some of the cross-border flows of capital, more interest potentially from the US. What are you seeing in terms of the investors, the capital that are beginning to look at the sector?
I think for investor capital into the UK, obviously it's a growth area. It's fairly, as I said earlier, embryonic. We don't actually have any one defined blueprint for product yet. There's a whole range, as Candace mentioned earlier. We mix across C2, which is institutional, to C3, which is standard residential. The advantage of that is it gives choice to people. Some people may just want to move into age-restricted housing and not have the care on site. Others the needs might be deteriorating and want the care on site. Probably what's fairly pertinent is the fact that the accommodation for senior living isn't registered with CQC. It's only actually the care provider. I don't know much about Europe, to be honest, so I don't know how it sort of compares over there. There is, I think people would like to see some comfort in terms of regulatory. It's similar to New Zealand, where they have the Retirement Act, but it's definitely a growth area. It's not just the prime southeast side. I think there's lots of potential for shared ownership across more sort of UK wide, and that's when the product needs to suit the location.
Okay, good. And what's happening in the Dutch market on that basis? Are you seeing new sorts of capital coming to you? What's the position there?
Yeah, well, I think it's getting globalized. First, I only was speaking with Stefan and with some Dutch players, but now I'm getting invitations from Germany, UK parties, Nordics, but also indeed the Americans, because we've got some REITs who are already 30 years active. They are also looking now to Europe because they are searching for investment volume, they're searching for yield. But actually, when I'm also listening to the conversation, I'm also interested whether we would like to normalize senior housing. Because when I'm hearing the communities, I'm getting a little bit of allergic, because I'm thinking you should make really specialized facilities for people with dementia or Asperger, but I think most of the people would like to stay as long as possible in their hometown. Indeed, what Stefan said, people would like to go back to where they were born, or so I'm actually quite curious whether we would make business cases with no demand, or we indeed try to make aging in the city, like being normalized senior housing within the normal residential side. I would like to make this business model work, and not to make an investment model who doesn't work. So I'm actually quite interested also with the attendees about the ideas about it.
Okay, good. Well, there will be lots of chance for that. So
Yeah.
And in terms of there was a question on it earlier, actually, which was, is senior living, is that really part of that urbanisation story? I mean, the interesting thing here is we're talking about people wanting to go back where they were originally living, but does that mean that it's actually the nearest town to where they were living, so that it's an urban landscape still that they're in, with walkable access to all of the services? I suppose, what is it that people are actually looking for?
I think that's probably true in the urban setting, because if you're in senior living, so you've got your own apartment with a bit of occasional healthcare, you're far more likely to want to be out and about in the community. And the challenge is, you see some pockets of it in London where there's some very high-end developments, like in Battersea, and one or two boutique ones in Chelsea, and there's some in North London as well, where they've actually been quite successful. But again, they're mostly a development product, where the promoters of those are making the money from the development. But what I think can work well is if you have a care home on the same site, so that if a couple move in where one of you's starting to think they might need some care, if they need to spend more time in the care home, they're only across the car park or in a different bit of the building, you're not abandoning them, and you can retain some of your independence.
I mean, are you looking at developing product that is urban, or are you looking at developing product that is not urban? Because the Netherlands obviously has a number of cities, but you've also got quite a disparate population.
Yeah.
So what's your sense of that? If you're looking to build something to meet the demand there, does that mean that you would build in sort of more like a village setting, or what's your...
Well, I think there's no one answer. I think you've got multiple type of clients with a variety of demands. So indeed, you've got more urban solutions. You've got more small-scale developments, more in the rural settings. So, and I think it will be the same for the UK and also for Germany. On the other hand, when we are looking to nursing homes, we have to be realistic also about the business case. Because when you look at a traditional nursing home for affordable rent, so not for the happy few who can pay 4,000 to 5,000 euros per month, but for affordable rent, it's quite difficult to make a good business case also for the operator side. And it's not only blue skies. I think it's getting more and more attention also for the operator. Therefore, also there's a consolidation because it's quite difficult to have a good operation on a small scale nursing home. So I think we're just in the beginning of this market, actually.
And Stefan, there's a question here that I wanted to pick up as well, and that's in terms of the differentiators in the French market that have driven the growth that we talked about, and also the international expansion of Domitis. I suppose, what's the differentiator that has led to growth? What is it that business is doing that others aren't? What are they servicing that's unique for that occupier?
We're talking specifically about Domitis or
well, the French market in general. Why?
The senior housing market. Okay, perfectly. Well, actually, hard to say, but from our perspective, and first of all, France was one of the first markets in Europe to become really mature in terms of care homes and senior housing. Okay, I can go into lots of details, but basically what we have seen in France is that the first operators that really turned towards operating senior housing were French. Might have something to do with the fact that they also had the very first bigger care home operators. So that probably inspired some other people in the market to step away from the typically care dependency business model towards a more independent business model. And then you've seen Domitis starting, but they started, if you look at the history of the company, Domitis actually is a combination of real estate developments, or developing really themselves apartment buildings throughout France, and they have an operating company which is really specializing in operating these buildings that they're developing. And they grew big by selling off lot for lot the apartments to private investors. So that was actually the first growth phase of Domitis. It's only, I think, since a couple of years now that they're also trying to do business with institutional investors, and they're selling the whole of the building with a master lease covered by their own operating company. So they went through this evolution that we have seen in the care home industry. And up till now, they're one of the very few countries where we have seen that evolution. With the exception of some of the things that we've seen in the Netherlands, but that's very often by not-for-profit operators. And we see now something similar happening in Germany.
Okay, good. I wanted to pick up a couple of views, and we've got Tim Street here. So, Tim, I just wanted to come to you, just for those who don't know, Tim is from Patron.
Sure. Patron's a real estate-focused private equity fund, European-focused. We've got around about $3 billion of equity under management. We raise sequential funds, and to date, we started investing in the health and social care market in the UK about 10 years ago. I've been in the sector for about 20 years. I've been on the board of Westminster Healthcare, which we sold to Barchester, Priory, Four Seasons, and then headed up the European Healthcare Advisory business at Macquarie for a while. So have seen a broad spectrum. One of the things we're focusing on elderly care in the UK with a development-led model in terms of creating new stock, because the replacement cycle of stock in the UK is around about 8,000 beds in, 8,000 beds out. So it's about a 50-year replacement cycle. So we see a real opportunity in creating stock for the must-have, assets that the institutional class are looking for, but also from a service provision, we wrap that up with a very, very high-quality care model. One of the things that have stopped us to date in growing into the retirement housing sector is very much around value creation that is beyond the development. So going back to the point is a lot of the developments you're seeing in central London are development-led, and behind them they do have the vision of creating that operating platform. But some of the things we've seen that have grown the businesses in Australia and the States, etc., is the fact that by creating scale, they get an actuarial type smoothing of one of the income streams from retirement, which is the deferred management charges or the reversionary interest in the leases. And we had a couple of false starts in the UK because of the Competition Commission having a look at even Max Stone's charges on reversionary interest in leases, and then also then others trying to find the model that works. Various people have various different charges, and it was quite confusing to the industry. I think that's now become a lot clearer in the UK. We've now seen some large institutions with patient capital investing in the space. And I think what we're going to see is that we're going to see that with those large patient capital investors behind the senior housing model, they'll start to build scale, and then they'll start to be able to value that second tier of income stream in the future, that we'll start to see much more development by these large players throughout the UK as we move forward. So I guess it's more a comment than a question.
Okay, good. That's good. And in terms of patron, are you, because it's UK focused at the moment?
Yes, so we are looking in Europe as well at the moment. There's certain markets, Netherlands, for example, where we see that there's a slight inflection point where you've got high wealth, again, similar to the UK. The population's about a quarter of the UK. It's a very big market. And there, the stock, again, is very old. There's been a lot of involvement from the charitable sectors and others. And I think that there's the expectations of people are high, and if they can't find that what they want, they're going to basically pay for where they need to get to. Across Europe, with an aging population, the problem is that the governments can't afford to provide this for the elderly, so they're going to have to cap the amount that they can pay. That means that private pay has to top up the rest, in whatever form, whatever jurisdiction. So our view is that if you can create a product that meets the expectations of the baby boomers, which is higher than any previous generation, then you will be able to create a product that has demand. You'll be able to then afford to deliver the level of care you need to deliver, and that's a very successful business model in any jurisdiction. So we're looking for the markets that have those inflection points of an opportunity to invest.
And do you see it as much more practical now than maybe it was 12 months ago, 24 months ago, even to begin to look at having a European platform portfolio?
The key thing for us is the thing that slows us is that it's spending the time trying to find the local operating partner. So in the UK, we're fortunate that we've got the ability we understand deeply the operations in the UK. Again, going back to the point that was made about regulation, I think you made the point about the differing regulation. You've got to have a good local operating partner. And from our perspective, it's about finding that. We did spend a considerable amount of time meeting lots of people in the Netherlands. A lot of them, there's some great operating partners there. It's just leveraging them out to want to partner with a foreign investor coming in. So I think that that's the key for us in terms of investing in new jurisdictions, is having the right team on the ground that understands the nuances of that market to be able to help accelerate their growth plan.
Okay, good, thank you. And Stefan, obviously you've already gone through that process of moving into different areas, specifically the UK as well. How do you solve that issue in terms of operator risk? One of the things that keeps coming up in terms of investors that I talk to is, but there's a lot of operator risk. How do you solve that issue?
Well, there always is a lot of operator risk, but what we have learned over the last, almost 15 years is that once you start doing business in other countries, you really find out quite fast, rapidly, that the drivers are the same throughout Europe. Basically, what you learn as an investor is to ask the right questions when you talk to an operator. Legislation is different, the way the financing care might be different, but at the end of the day, all of these European authorities, all of these European governments are facing the same challenges. And I once said during a seminar, there might be 50 ways to leave your lover, but there are not 50 ways to finance care. So basically it's about the mix of public money going in. And what we see in most European countries is that the authorities are really focusing on financing through social security systems care dependency, and definitely not financing anything before care dependency. So when we're talking senior housing, I fully agree, definitely will be a private pay market. And what you see in most European countries, including the UK, by the way, is that there is a mix between public money going to care dependency and private pay. So in the UK, it might be to the extreme that you are a self-payer until the point that we don't longer have anything left. In most European countries, it is from day one a mix. But as soon as you understand that, then it's quite easy to talk to the operators and ask the right questions and get to an agreement with them on the rent cover, on the type of buildings that they need, etc., etc. So,
one of the things I wanted to pick up actually as well is, and I don't know the position in other European countries, so this will be useful information for me, is obviously here in the UK there's a very big discussion about the difference between cure, as you would put it in terms of illness and the NHS, but then also social care in terms of other things like dementia, which is long-term care in a way that is not funded currently by the government in the same way, or the public purse, but it looks as though that's going to be an ongoing discussion, which presumably will create quite a large opportunity in this sector, or not, or am I misreading that?
I think the aspiration in the sector has always been that to try and resolve what's, I think, basically deeply inequitable, that if you get cancer, you're fairly well looked after by the NHS and it's fully funded. If you get dementia, you're basically on your own, apart from the limited social care provision that there is, and integration between health and social care, which can bring better outcomes and actually save the NHS a lot of money if you do it well. Some of the care homes we've had where they've had NHS contracts for step-down beds and time to assess, etc., relieve bed blocking as well as saving money. It's a fraction of the cost to keep someone in a care home. So I think that debate, and part of the political paralysis, people say, well, what's the impact? And we discussed long about what's the impact of on the UK, and I admire Difficut for looking long-term, looking through the short-term issues. But one of the issues is nothing's being done about these crucial day-to-day issues, because all the political capital is devoted to something else. Can't even bring myself to say the word. And I think that's a challenge, and it's, as I learn more about other markets, there are similar challenges, but it just strikes me that, for example, in Germany they have the sort of social care levy, and there's quite a lot of talk about doing something similar here, and I think we need a version of that or something to actually have more robust funding, because at the moment the local authorities, in many cases, half of their budget is going on social care, and it's unsustainable at the moment. And the only thing that's sort of keeping some local authority funded homes going is the top-ups, is the private sector also managing that. So something has to happen, but the problem is we've been talking about this for maybe 10 years.
Samantha, did you want to pick that up?
There's been quite a lot of talk about dementia care villages recently as well, and I think from talking to the various operators, there's sort of a fine line between probably safety and occupation as well when they're in homes. That's when I think the advantage of having a care home on site would be useful, because then people can transition across. But equally, looking at the operational perspective, it's very important for the operator to make sure that their village is fairly sort of stable and it doesn't turn into an ageing population or a dementia, which is really not sort of quite what their aim is.
Okay, good. And does this, I mean, Candace, you mentioned slightly about the ESG thing. Do you think this fits into that sort of impact investing side, and is therefore likely, if we can get the product right, is likely to attract a lot more institutional investment?
Yes, I agree entirely, and we're seeing a lot of institutional investors, pension funds, and the US, where ESG is quite well developed, really interested in healthcare and retirement living, because, as I said earlier, ESG ticks all the boxes. I mean, they're certainly on developing new product. Everything has to be sustainable, and with the governance, CQC is already driving that in the industry.
Will demand grow? Whilst demand will grow, will rent growth be limited due to the affordability of pensions and the available public support? What's anybody's thought on that? So we've got obviously growing demand, growing appetite for different and probably better product, but will it actually work in terms of rental?
I think when it's a private model, it probably, but it's a macroeconomic driver there.
I think the rental product will work. I don't think it's going to be immediate, if I'm honest. We're probably a couple of years off. But actually, from a day-to-day perspective, you're effectively, the one payment of rent you're providing will encompass your service charge, and then anything else is going to be care needs on top.
Okay, good. I've got a quick question here as well. It came in, and this is probably, well, it'll be for you, Stefan, or you, Ron, which is, who are the developers in the Netherlands? Is the market widespread and only small developments? Is there enough product? And I guess the other part of that is there really enough product of sufficient size to actually be of interest to cross-border investment?
Well, I think we also have to be realistic because I'm now for 15 years in the healthcare real estate business, and it's not a very fast market. So when I look at my pipeline for the next 2-3 years, I think we have over 300 to 400 senior living apartments. When I look at the nursing home, or the elderly care type, we're talking about maybe 200 million in terms of investment volume for the next 2-3 years. So it always takes a lot of time, because also the operator side, there are very traditional people. They got their committees. They have to rethink about it. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. I'm a big player in the Netherlands, but also for us, it's hard work to get this market ongoing. But feel free to get in contact, because it's, I think, no, just to be honest, it's an interesting market. In the Netherlands, you see some yield compression because there's a vast amount of investors who are entering the Dutch market. But I think there are a lot of opportunities in the next 5 years, so feel free.
Okay, good. I want to look a little bit at, particularly at the future of this in the last few minutes here. So what kind of products do you think providers should be providing? What will the market be looking for? I suppose, what are you thinking in terms of when you're developing? Let's start with you, Stefan, in terms of what you see going forward. I mean, there was a mention of pets already here.
Pets friendly, yeah.
First of all, we do believe that everything to do with care dependency will probably remain the most important part of the healthcare market in Europe. And when I have a quick look at the major US players, the Welltowers and the Ventas of this world, I think that even in their portfolios, up to 70%, more or less, this is very roughly right, of what they're doing has to do with care dependency for elderly people and or senior housing. I do think that senior housing will develop, but it really is a private pay market, and it will be very different in different markets. But locally it will develop. Thirdly, I also expect cure to become more important. Cure, well, we didn't talk about that, it was not on the agenda, but cure in Europe remains, with the exception of a couple of countries, not really a very relevant market segment in healthcare, but we do believe also that if we would have this session 5 or 10 years from now, that you probably will talk a lot about care dependency for elderly people, much more about senior housing, and also probably a bit more about cure.
How important is adaptability? So that, for example, if you build something that is senior living, it just comes from some of the discussions we've had in both in student housing and in micro living, the ability to be able to adapt that if the market should change and a different product is required, that maybe therefore this is not just purely senior living, this could actually be something else. How important is that in terms of, I suppose, sustainability of the investment?
I'm happy to pick that one up. I think the flexibility of the buildings is important. I mean, even products that are established now, we're seeing people adapt. So where historically people have built one-bedroom apartments, quite often people buying two side by side and knocking through to create a larger one. Likewise on the communal facilities. The one we saw recently had a fairly small cinema. Now they've knocked through into the activities room to buy a bigger cinema. So it's got to be adaptable, really, because I mean these buildings are going to last for 50 years plus, and times are changing.
And I also think we're seeing in London, certainly, people like the Collective and Get Living who are building very small apartments for the 20 to 30 age group, wanting total flexibility with large communal spaces and bars, etc. I think that's fine when you're 25 and working for Deloitte and just going home to sleep. But I think it's, or Savills perhaps, but I actually think that when you're 60 plus and it's your home and you want to spend time in your home, you need somewhere bigger, and the developers are still not really developing that sort of product. So that's my top tip. Please build what people want to live in.
I think just picking up from that, also as your needs increase, where's your carer going to stay if they require overnight care? And if you've got a one-bedroom apartment, they're going to be sleeping on the sofa. It's not ideal. So yeah, flexibility is really important.
And one of the things that's quite, I mean, often if you look at the demographics, yes, you'll have people that need care, but sometimes it will be only, let's say that people have moved as a couple into senior living. Often it's only one half of the couple that requires the care, and so you then have to have a different sort of, I suppose, series of amenities that enables both of them to have a happy and enjoyable life.
I think that's why you need the care home and you need the retirement flats or the senior living side by side, so that actually, if one of you's deteriorating quicker than the other, you don't feel you've abandoned them when they start to need more constant care. And that's why I think as an investor you want, I'd be happier investing in something which incorporates both, actually.
The funny thing is that for the sake of this discussion, we're making this huge distinction between senior housing or senior living and care dependency on the one hand. But if you look at the reality in the field, what we have seen is brand new senior housing buildings, apartments, where people move in on average 80 years old. They stay there on average 8 to 9 years. But 8 or 9 years later, if you look at the care levels of people living there, they're close to care dependency. So basically, there's a huge grey zone between senior housing and care dependency. And I truly believe that lots of these senior housing facilities might become the care homes of the future.
Right.
But will
I totally agree. So, to my opinion, alternative use is irrelevant. Because when you're making the right product for the right price, you actually have a guaranteed cash flow for 30 years. However, the needs of your customer is changing.
That's great. I've got one more question that I've saved until the end. So thank you for being very patient, whoever asked this one, which is, what are your recommendations for a senior housing investment strategy for a shorter term, 7 to 10 years, rather than the 2060 demographic change? So I'm going to have two parts to this question, which is, one, where would you see the sort of best opportunities? And also then, what would be your recommendation for a shorter term strategy over the next 7 to 10 years rather than maybe a 30-year strategy? Who wants to start with that? Should we start with you, Bruce?
I'll go first. I think short term, I'd probably look at pockets of affluence, because as we say, it's a privately funded market. There's a real lack of product, so if you get it right, I think there's quite deep markets in London, Edinburgh, certain places with a certain level of affluence. That's not just London, there's a fair bit going on there, and I think in the short term that affluence is probably going to remain.
Okay, good, thank you. Candace, I'm going to come to you. You can either choose to answer that, or if there's any specific thing that you think is very important in terms of investing, just in case you tell me that you're a lawyer and therefore you.
Well, as we touched on earlier, I think as people are renting at a younger age for much longer, it will be much more acceptable at the senior living end to rent. And so I think the rental models, I agree with Samantha, that it's a couple of years off getting the pricing and the product right. But I think that's the opportunity growth going forward.
And do you think that'll then be a sort of insurance market model, i.e. that people will then insure themselves and that rent will be paid by the insurance company?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think the insurers have rather failed to deliver on appropriate products, and there's been some very bad examples of it historically. I think if we're heading into a downturn, then what would be it would be easier for older people is to rent their family home, and that will provide an income that will then...
I think just to pick up on that, if you look at the rise of PRS, the professionalisation of that, I see it as sort of one way of looking at it is PRS for the elderly most.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Investment, Ron.
Well, I think the location is a no-brainer. That would be the Netherlands. And in terms of short-term business cases, I would suggest start with existing residential buildings to transform it to senior housing.
Okay, good. Samantha.
I think, picking back up on the rental product, with an established operator in situ, I think the rental product will work because people will have confidence in it.
Okay, Stefan, where should these good people invest? Plainly with a Difficut.
Yeah, but without revealing all the know-how of a Difficut. No, basically, I think the best piece of advice I could give is go with the operators, follow the operators. At the end, this business is not so much about bricks and mortar, it's about people, older people growing old. What do baby boomers want and what will they be looking for in the future? And it's about people taking care of other people, so try and understand their care concepts. And if that works, then you can build a suitable and the right building for that, and you will have to make the good investments.
Thank you, everybody.